Hey folks, and welcome to this week's Weaver's Woodshop. And this week I'm going to be making a hope chest. This hope chest is going to be about 40 inches long, about 18 inches tall, and about 20 inches wide. This hope chest is going to be made out of pine, cypress, and cedar, and will be lined on the inside with cedar. The reason I'm going to line it on the inside with cedar is cedar has a lot of natural repellents and natural chemicals and things that help keep pests and things away. So therefore, if you want to help it, or if you want to use this box to help keep things in its natural state, whether it's clothes or photos or whatever, cedar is a great thing to use for things like that. So you've seen me cut some of the frame down to size, down to length on the miter saw, and then you saw me cut it to width there on the table saw, and now I'm making sure it is the proper width on the planer. So that is what you've seen me do so far. And now that I have all of the framework dimensioned to what I think I'd like for it to be, it's time to cut it to size. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm not really running off of anyone's plans. I'm building this one to sell, actually. So I'm just kind of figuring out and going with what I think looks right. So that's what you see me doing here. I got a tape measure out and getting my pieces over there. And like I said, just figuring out what looks right to me. And that's what I'm doing here. And once I figure it out, I'll start running it over to the miter saw and getting the angle of the dangle looking right. And then we'll start putting it together. Okay, and now I got everything cut to size for this part of the framework anyway, so it's time to glue it up and put some brad nails in it. And you can see that's what I'm doing here. I'm putting a little bit of glue on it, and I'll put all four of them corners together, and we'll go from there. So now it's time to make the vertical part of the box. So what you see me doing there is those pieces that you see me handling, and the two pieces, well, actually the four pieces that you see already attached to the box. They do already have the pocket holes in them that I am gluing and screwing to the box that I already have made. And there's also a 45-degree cut where the two pieces come together to help me join my 90 degrees there at the corner. So I'm gluing and screwing them down to the box that I already have made. And where they join together, there's a 45-degree cut where they join together. So I am gluing that and brad nailing them together as well. And there's also a pocket hole screwed on the what's going to be the top side here, because I will build another rectangle, and to set on the top, and I will be gluing and screwing it down to that as well. All right, now I've got all the vertical, we'll call them legs in this case, attached. And I've also made the other rectangle, and I'm attaching it here. And what I'm using the face clamp, that Craig face clamp, to keep everything flush. But I'm also using that 36-inch clamp to keep everything tight as I'm screwing down that pocket hole screw. And again, I'm gluing and screwing at the same time, just to get everything good and snug in there. And now that I have the frame all assembled and the glue and the brad nails and the screws and everything, it's time to start putting the sides on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, lay the floor out and get it all good to go. And that's what I'm doing now is I'm laying the floor out. And actually, for some reason, I decided to glue the floor together, just kind of like a tabletop. Don't know why I did that, but that's what I decided to do. So that's what I'm doing here is I've got everything cut down and planed up, so everything's all nice and together. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm laying it out and making sure it looks right, and then I'm gonna glue it together, let it dry overnight, and I'll come back tomorrow and I'll screw it down after some trimming up, and we'll get it on there and get it going. All right, now that the glue is all dry and everything's been sanded, it's time to go ahead and try and start fitting it on there. So that's what I'm doing here is putting the frame on the bottom there and just seeing how everything fits and checking it out and eyeing it up. And it's looking like I need to go ahead and trim it up a little bit. So I think that's what I'm getting ready to do is go and trim it up just a little bit. And got me a little straight edge there just to see how everything's going to fit because I want it to be flush to the sides. So that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to go trim it up, and then you'll see me bring it back, and then I'll actually flip everything over and go ahead and screw it down to the frame. And now that we have everything all looking the way that I want it to, it's time to go ahead and attach it. So I'm pre-drilling the holes before I put the screws in. So that's what I'm doing now is drilling everything up and sinking the screws in. And the bottom of this hope chest is the only place that I have screws. Everywhere else is either glued or glue and brad nails. So again, I'm putting screws around the bottom. On the short side, I have 4 screws per side, and along the longer sides, I have 5 screws. If you like this kind of material and you have not yet subscribed, please go ahead over and do so, and go ahead and like it and share it on out there. And now it's time to get the rest of the sides on. So that's what I'm doing here, is gluing up the rest of the sides and putting some brad nails in it. So now that I have the outer shell all done, it's time to go ahead and get the inside lined with those cedar planks. So I just put some glue down, and I've got the cedar planks already cut to size. So I'm just simply going in and putting some brad nails in, and I'm going to go ahead and get the inside lined. Now it's time to get the lid going, and what I'm doing now is just placing the wood together and trying to lay it out in I don't know, in a design that I like, because as you can see, I've got one thin piece there that it's got to make sense to me. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm moving it around, and this is the pattern that ends up making sense to me. And so that's the pattern I go with, but I got to sand it all down here, and so that's what I'm doing. I sand it all down and I put it together, and then we'll go from there. Now that I've got the top together, I'm going to go ahead and measure and mark where the hinges are going to go. However, I am not going to mount the top at this time. These are just marks that I'm going to reference a little bit later once I get some trim on and things like that. So now it's time to start ripping down some trim. The corners, the way that they are right now, I just can't leave them naked like that. So I'm ripping down some trim to go ahead and start making this thing look just a little bit better. Now that the trim is all trimmed to the proper width, it's time to go ahead and start cutting it up, or actually cutting it down to size and fitting it where it needs to go. So that's what the next part of this is going to be, is just gluing all this trim on. I do glue all the trim on. I only put the brad nails where I absolutely have to, just because I try my best not to see any nails or screws or anything. That's why right here you see me putting the brad nails on the underneath side, so hopefully you won't see any. And that's why the only place that I put screws on is the underneath of the floor there, so you won't see any. I just would prefer not to see any if at all possible. Okay, and now back to the parts that I marked for the hinges. Um, Now that all the trim is on, it's time to go ahead. Well, most of the trim is on. I shouldn't even say most. How about a lot? It's time to go ahead and pre-drill and install those hinges. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm pre-drilling and putting the screws in for the hinges. just something to try and make this hope chest look a little bit better. I'm going to route out where those hinges sit, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm routing out a little groove so those hinges can sit flush, and it'll just make the hope chest just look a little bit better. Now it's time for a little test fit after making that initial router pass. And I did make it just a little too small, but that's okay because it's better to make it too small than too big. So I had to go back and do one more pass with the router just to make it just a little bit bigger. Now that I got those grooves routed out where they fit nice and flush, I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill all the holes and get the screws in there for the hinges and get them in there nice and flush. Here we go with more trim. Time for more trim. So time to glue and clamp and wait. Before I put my coat of polyacrylic on this, I want to go ahead and drill my holes for the handles. So that's what I'm doing here. I've got a spacer that I'm going to use to measure how far down I'm going to go. And I'm going to use that on both sides. And I've got my tape measure so I end up in the same place on both sides. And I'm going to drill my holes and then I'll sand it smooth. And then that way I'll be good to go for my polyacrylic. Now that all the prep work is done, it's time to go ahead and put that polyacrylic on. With polyacrylic, you stir it, you do not shake it. And if it seems like I'm dipping my brush a lot, it's because you do want to keep your brush damp when applying polyacrylic. Polyacrylic has some characteristics that I am not fully familiar with yet. So I am unsure on if I'm a fan of polyacrylic yet, and I'm sure as I use it more, I will get better with it. So if you're thinking of using polyacrylic, do your homework first. I knew that it would probably be okay for this project, and it did come out exactly like I expected it to. But again, just do your homework first if you're thinking of using it for your project. And there's a shot of the exact polyacrylic I used, and here is a shot of the finished product. Like I said, it turned out pretty nice. So thank you for watching this week's Weaver's Wood Shop, and we'll see you next week.